Zelensky is the last person from which he want to receive help.
So Obama had made this nuclear deal.
And Trump cancelled it during his first.
America's priority is this war in Iran. He's agreed to sell weapons to Europe to give to Ukraine because it makes money, but it's not a priority. It's just a way to make money.
Oil prices increased a lot. It is not profitable for Ukraine. At the same time, Russia receives advantages from these prices on oil and deficit of oil. Why Ukraine decided to help Arabian countries, but also Israel and Arabian countries?
We know more about drones than anybody.
Вітаю.
Вітаю.
Hello, today we will talking about war USA and Israel against Iran and consequences of this war for Ukraine. And Isaac, look, artist Katya Akvarelina prepared for Billi-Villi a new illustration to this topic. It's Domino. What do you think about this illustration?
I think it's simple and effective. I really like it. We can see, for me, this is American and Israeli rockets to start this process, which then leads to a sort of domino effect with maybe Iranian drones leading to a rise in oil prices, and then the result of the rise in oil prices is for easing sanctions on Russia and in fact Iran as well. So you've kind of got this process of all of these things collapsing, and yeah, I think the image shows it quite clearly. One thing I was also thinking is about these shadows. So of course this is the dominoes and the shadows. And in English there's a nice phrase to cast a long shadow, so to have a big impact even after something is gone. So I think particularly around the oil prices and the sanctions, we'll see the impact of events that are happening now for a long time, months or even years into the future. What do you think?
Yeah, for me it's the same, that this domino principle, when action on the first element causes this chain reaction to neighbors elements and leading from regional conflict to global consequences. And this war in Middle East, everybody feels it. In Middle East, in Europe, in Africa, in Japan, in China, even in Latin America, and of course in USA. So it has a global consequences, and today we'll talk about consequences for Ukraine from this conflict, but maybe let's start from the causes of this war. Why Israel and USA decided to attack Iran now, and what are purposes of USA and Israel in this conflict? What is purpose of Iran in this conflict, and maybe Gulf countries? We saw different statements from White House about purposes of this conflict. Trump said that they try to protect American people from Iranian regime threats, and they want to destroy military potential of Iran. And what do you think? This statement, these purposes which Trump and other representatives of White House talked about, are they justified?
Yeah, I think it's kind of unclear what exactly the purposes are from America and to some extent from Israel too. I think the initial aim for both was definitely regime change, and we saw in kind of the opening hours, the first days of this attacks on Iran, Trump and Netanyahu were kind of calling for Iranian people to overthrow their government and to change the regime. And whether that's justified or not, I guess is a moral question. But I think for Trump especially, it really came from the bloody crackdowns on the protests in January. And at that point, he committed already to helping the Iranian people, and he said help is on the way. But he wasn't able to do anything at that time because there weren't really enough troops, ships, and so on in the region for him to use. So he kind of then, I think, committed to this course of action, and over January and February built up these forces so that he could eventually do something. And for Israel, of course, there's a similar aim where they feel very threatened by this Iranian regime who deny Israel's existence and are really committed to destroying Israel. Whether that's just rhetoric or reality is up for debate, but Israel would obviously like a different regime in power. And so I think that was the initial aim. And then since then, it feels to me like both Israel and America have accepted that failed. And they're kind of seeking different aims. You know, sometimes he said they talk about nuclear programs, sometimes about the missile program, sometimes about proxies and Hamas, Hezbollah. And now, of course, America has this new aim, really, of trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and bring down oil prices, which is something that wouldn't have happened if he hadn't begun the war. So if the war aim is just trying to find the status quo from before the war, I think it obviously shows that something has gone quite wrong. So I think, we now see this divergence between what America wants and what Israel wants, and that's leading to different different sort of conflicts, perhaps between the two countries over Israel attacking Iran's oil and gas infrastructure, for example. America wants to keep these prices low. Israel preparing for a longer war, and Trump trying to find a shorter war. So it feels to me like there's some tension here. What do you think? Kind of what other aims maybe, or do you see a most important aim for either of them?
I agree that USA and Israel now try to use the situation when Iran is weak. Purpose of Israel is more clear for me, for example, than American purposes. Israel wants to destroy Iran's capability to attack Israel and through proxies, through Hezbollah, through Hamas, and other proxies. And we see this action of Israel towards Hamas in Gaza, towards Hezbollah in Lebanon, and direct actions against Iran. And what about USA? Before Trump said that interests of America are in the West Hemisphere, but we see this interfere in Iran now, and we understand that America has allies in the region. But at the same time, it seems to me that there are other reasons, including nuclear reason that Trump wants to control nuclear potential in the world. We know that he wants to resign some agreements with countries who has nuclear weapon, And other important reason may be energetic security, because America is focused on providing its energetic security, and maybe they hoped to use weakness of Iran to receive more impact on energetic security in the world. So and about changing regime, maybe it would be desirable task purpose of USA, but USA understood before attack that it is very difficult to achieve, and maybe they wanted, they hoped to change regime, but if not, they hope to change behavior of Iran. But now we see that Iran has some advantages, military advantages before USA, and it uses actively. And about Iranian purposes, before Iran has had purpose to be leader among Islamic countries, but now the main purpose, it seems to me, is to save regime.
Yeah, I agree. I think regime change, it really seemed from recent reporting to have come from Israel and from Mossad, who said that they had this capability to, you know, if Iran's leadership is taken out, that the intelligence services could bring about some regime change, and they persuaded Netanyahu, who persuaded Trump. So I think you're right that it seems, you know, America was less convinced of this, and Israel has led a lot of the strikes on, the first strikes on the supreme leader and other, you know, high-ranking officials, but also more recently on intelligence officials, military officials, the security forces. It seems like Israel is really leading these attacks, while the US focuses more on military capabilities. And I think with Trump too, there's always a very personal element to his actions. And I mentioned about his commitment to the Iranian people before, but I think the other personal element is this competition with Obama that seems to be behind a lot of what he does. So Obama had made this nuclear deal,
and Trump cancelled it during his first.
Cancelled it, yeah, and he wants to make a better deal, and he's been unable to do that. He tried to negotiate something, you know, during February before the strikes, and Iran, you know, wasn't really willing to make these concessions. So I think Trump is trying to find some way to achieve this legacy. And I think the other kind of important thing here is about this diplomacy and this. I think within Israel, there's a reluctance to allow Iran to exist in any form like this. So they really were, I think, unhappy with the diplomacy that Trump was trying to do. I think Trump could sell their interests, basically, make some compromise, lift sanctions on Iran, allow it to stabilize somehow. And these strikes began just as Oman's foreign minister was saying that there's real progress on a deal and maybe something will happen. And similarly for Netanyahu, there seems to be constant conflict in the region. He doesn't want to make the regional order through deals and through compromises and agreements. I think he wants to make it through force. Obviously there was huge attacks on Gaza and Hamas, then on Lebanon and Hezbollah, also on Iran last summer and Iran now. And I think partly that's, a desire not to legitimize any of these actors through sitting down at the negotiation table and, giving them things that they want. But also there's some sort of internal focus for Netanyahu, who faces, I think, a lot of domestic pressure over how October 7th was allowed to happen, security failures in his government, And also there's this corruption trial, I think multiple corruption trials ongoing. So as long as Israel is in a constant state of emergency, he manages to avoid this scrutiny, really. So I think there's lots of interlocking motivations for Israel and America. And I think that led them really to not take negotiations that seriously, it seemed to me, in that period before the strikes. Iran also didn't take it that seriously, I think because Iran understood better that a revolution was unlikely after January. So while America and Israel hoped that this would give them the advantage, I think Iran also recognized that they weren't as weak, so they didn't need to basically surrender. And also Iran knew that they had a better strategy than in June of 2025, when they essentially lost the war. So they came up with a new strategy, and it's working quite effectively, I think, to attack Gulf countries, to raise the oil price. So Iran, I think, recognized that they were in a stronger position. Israel and America believed that they were in a stronger position. And that's why there wasn't really serious negotiations or progress on a deal, because all sides thought that they could do better through a war.
Look, this war lasts for almost 1 month, and now it looks like escalation continues. We see these statements from America, and their actions, they prepare more forces, and there is a possibility of their attack on Khark's Island, to take control under this island. And Iran, we also see these messages about possible negotiations and communications between America and Iran, and these demands and these conditions, we see that there is no field possibilities for compromise. And as Iran is against pressure of America, against interfering America into Iranian internal affairs. And as more pressure of America, as more resistance of Iran, resistance of regime against their main enemy, maybe. And so we see that war lasts, that it may be escalating of situation. And what does it mean for Ukraine? What consequences of this war for Ukraine could be? Now we see only negative consequences. We see that oil prices increased a lot. It is not profitable for Ukraine, not only for Ukraine, but we talk about Ukraine now. Because we depend on energetic resources a lot. Fuel will cost more, all goods will cost more, and we have to pay more. Russia, at the same time, Russia receives advantages from these prices on oil and deficit of oil. We saw this canceling sanctions for India on Russian oil for 30 days and other steps from Trump's administration regarding Russian oil. So Russia has benefits from this war, and Russia's capability to continue war against Ukraine also increase. What else? We afraid that war against Iran attract attention from war Russia against Ukraine. Yes, but what means distracted attention. Not just that media will talk about Iran, not Ukraine. It divert resources from Ukraine. We see how many missiles America uses in Middle East war, how many missiles for Patriots Arabian countries need to protect themselves from Iranian missiles and Iranian drones. And the price of weapons is increasing. So if Ukraine bought before this weapon in one price, now we can face with new prices much more than before. And the biggest problem, deficit of these missiles, these weapons which we need here, and because America directs all these resources to Middle East, and Arabian countries they are ready to pay more for these weapons. So there is a problem. A lot of risks. There are a lot of risks for Ukraine from this war. But at the same time, what consequences else do you see from these relations between Ukraine and Gulf countries, between Ukraine and Israel, between Ukraine and USA?
Yeah, it's a lot of complicated relationships going on, I think. I think you're right about all of these consequences. Probably the most important one for me is oil price, because it really solves Russia's biggest issue in this war, is the budget deficit and its own economy. And it was looking close to a point where the pressure could maybe start to force Russia to change its actions somehow. And now I think it's gained a lot of confidence, because essentially, if Russia sells oil for about $40, maybe $50 a barrel, that's when it starts making profit. So when the oil price was a lot lower, close to this, it was hardly making any money, and it becomes a lot harder then to fund missiles, drones, contracts for soldiers, and so on. Now it's, and the Russian budget for this year was assuming the price of oil is around $60, and now it's $100 or more per barrel. Russia's making so much profit, it's able to cover all of its deficit in its budget, and probably continue a lot longer. There are some kind of nuances, I guess, around Ukraine has been attacking Russian oil exports in Ust-Luga and Primorsk especially, so that brings down how much oil Russia can export, and also closing Druzhba as well. Like, Ukraine is trying to limit the damage here, but it's the most important long-term consequence, I think, is that all of the progress of the past, well, it depends how long this goes on, but the progress of the last year or 2 years through sanctions and so on is really being undone right now. I think, also distraction in terms of, like you said, missiles and weapons for Ukraine, and the peace process too. America just doesn't have the focus, the capabilities to manage everything at once. Mainly because I think it tries to run everything through two people, through Witkoff and Kushner, who are trying to negotiate with Hamas, with Ukraine and Russia, with Iran, all at the same time. It's and I think Russia, we've seen, is quite happy with this peace process really being paused, especially now that they feel less pressure to find an agreement because of the oil price. So the situation right now, I think, it doesn't look so good for Ukraine.
And why Ukraine decided to help Arabian countries?
So there's a big...
Not only Arabian, sorry, but also Israel and Arabian countries.
Yeah, I think there's a big opportunity in the longer term for Ukraine to reshape these relationships. So with Middle Eastern, Gulf countries, so particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but also Qatar, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, who have all been attacked by Iran. So Ukraine has world-leading expertise in how to counter these Shahed drones. And of course, these countries now are really interested in these defense relationships with Ukraine, and Ukrainian experts and drones are in the Middle East already achieving this. So with the Gulf countries, I think there's a lot of opportunities here because they've really historically favoured Russia because they have a lot deeper relations with Russia to do with energy, of course, and cooperating through OPEC Plus on oil prices and oil production to allow everybody to make the most amount of profit, basically. And they also, considered Russia to be a more important regional actor with its interests in Syria, in Iran. And there's also some arms trade between them, and there's significantly sanctions avoidance. So the UAE particularly, in 2022, its trade with Russia increased by 68%, which is just, good sanctioned goods going through the UAE into Russia, basically. And it's now worth over $12 billion per year. And none of these countries have applied sanctions directly to Russia or really implement Western sanctions either. So Ukraine doesn't really have the same history of relations. It was a kind of agricultural exporter to these countries, but it wasn't considered so important. And these relationships weren't very deep. Ukraine doesn't really have the interpreters, the cultural presence, the personal relationships to achieve much in this region until perhaps now. And suddenly these relations are really deepening in terms of, for example, Zelensky's just been in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia signing a weapons, arms deal. A UAE company has bought 30% of Firepoint, the Ukrainian weapons manufacturer too. And so because they face similar threats, I think, especially these Shahed drones, but also this Russian-Iranian axis, there's an opportunity to deepen cooperation. And I think this is perhaps one of the most important areas of the world that Ukraine could expand its influence in, because these countries have a lot of money. They have huge sovereign wealth funds from their oil profits, which they invest around the world in projects, so that really when the oil runs out, they have these investments, they have other sources of income. So that could really help with investments in Iran's weapons industry, of course, but also in energy reconstruction, for example, or transitioning towards green energy that would reduce Russia's control over Ukraine through oil and gas and so on. I think these countries could also really help through sanctions, of course, if they recognize that allowing Russia to receive components for Shaheds actually impacts their own security, then they might start to take more serious action. And I also think in a bigger perspective, if Ukraine has allies in this region, for the world in general, for the global south, perhaps Ukraine's fight stops being perceived as just a Western cause or a European cause, but starts to be seen as something more about global stability, about keeping oil prices lower, stopping drones just attacking buildings. And I think that's something that Russia has really been able to get a lot of support from countries outside of the West, or at least acceptance of what Russia does. But that could start to change if there's some sort of new message about how Ukraine is providing security for the world and how that affects the economy and so on. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here with a potentially developing relationship with these countries for Ukraine.
Agree, and also Ukraine is interested in finishing this war in Middle East. As soon as this war in Middle East finishes, as soon attraction to Ukraine back and prices on oil decrease. That's why we have direct interest. But at the same time, there are a lot of criticism towards Ukraine that we have war, we need drones, air defense here, and at the same time we interfere in other war in Middle East for what? Yes, one of the reasons is that our direct interest in finishing war in Middle East. But of course, it is difficult to assess the role of Ukraine in it now. You are right that it is a long-term perspective. Then Russia is a strategic partner of Iran. But what we see, Israel doesn't precise Russia as Iran. And Arabic countries also, they don't precise Russia the same way as Iran, as they precise Iran. Can we change this perception of Israel and by Israel and by Arabic countries, the perception of Russia? I have doubts because look, strategy of Arabic countries is also always was to stay neutral, to be a mediator, and they tried to cooperate and with Russia and with Ukraine. Our trade, Ukrainian trade with Arabic countries, increased during last 4 years. But the biggest partner among Arabic countries is Saudi Arabia. It's about $300-400 million of trade between countries. We have not bad trade relations with Israel. It's about $1 billion. And Ukraine sells more and export more than import. So it is profitable for Ukraine, profitable to develop these relations. We have interests, common interests in agriculture, in military technology, and but at the same time, Arabic countries help Russia to avoid sanctions. So we see they cooperate with Ukraine and they cooperate with Russia. Israel, they sometimes support Ukraine in some cases, including voting in UN. Sometimes it votes against Ukraine's resolutions. Arabic countries mostly abstain from voting for Ukraine's resolution. They try to maintain this neutral role and to be a mediator. And also they help Ukraine to bring back children from Russia, to release prisoners. Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine mentioned key tasks of Ukraine cooperation with Arabic countries. They said that Ukraine hopes to receive political support, but we know that they try to be neutral. It's not a very simple task. Then to impose sanctions against Russia. For now, on this stage, I don't see the prerequisites for imposing sanctions by these countries against Russia. Another task is spreading cooperation in military, in defense sphere, and the forces receive support in restoring Ukraine. I think in some tasks are more real, another hard to achieve. It's about long-term cooperation. On political support, also impact relations between Ukraine and Israel. How Ukraine perceives Israel, how to cooperate with Israel, and on relations between Ukraine and Israel impacts Palestine and relations between Ukraine and Palestine. And you know that Ukraine often supports Palestine in UNN. So these relations are very complicated in Middle East, and there are a lot of opportunities, but there are a lot of risks and nuances, and it's a big work for a long-term perspective.
Definitely. And I think we often think of these questions in kind of black and white. You know, it's like, which side are you on, Ukraine or Russia, Israel or Palestine? So, you know, people take positions, but in the Middle East, it's kind of difficult to do that because, like you say, it's so complicated, so many interconnected relationships. So countries tend to work on certain priorities, certain themes with some countries and other ones with other countries. And so they all have kind of working relationships. And I guess Ukraine is just trying to position itself within that world. And I think, yeah, like you said, the relationship with Israel is also very complicated. Ukraine doesn't also have the deepest relationship. I mean, there's a connection over, you know, a large Jewish population in Ukraine and some kind of historical similarities about seeking statehood and so on. But really, yeah, Israel has also favored connections with Russia historically, because there's a large Russian-speaking population. Diaspora from the Soviet Union countries, I think it's about 12% of the Israeli population. Of course, these aren't all Russian, but they're kind of claimed to be Russian by Putin especially. 12%. Of course, some of these are Ukrainians, but Putin kind of manipulates this Soviet legacy as a Russian legacy. So Israel has also considered Russia to be an important regional actor because of its interests in Syria, on Iran, and trying to keep these kind of workable relations. So even though they are on different sides in Syria, for example, in the Syrian civil war, Israel would give advanced warning to Russia when they're going to attack maybe Iranian proxies in the country, or if there's anything that could be related to Russian activities, they would avoid attacking Russian assets. So there was some sort of, even though they were fighting against each other in a way, they tried to keep a working relationship, and the same over Iran. But that's kind of begun to stop since 2023, with Russian support for proxies. So I think the vast majority of weapons that Israel seized from Hezbollah were made in Russia, and there's sources of funding coming through as well. So I think Israel is recognizing that Russia really is working against their interests in the region, and now Russia has lost its influence in Syria with the fall of Assad, who has gone to Moscow, of course. So perhaps Israel recognizes that it doesn't need to placate Russia so much, in the sense of, it didn't condemn Russia's annexation of Crimea, it didn't condemn the full-scale invasion. It expressed support for Ukraine, but it didn't vote in the UN to criticize Russia's actions, for example. And I think it's gradually changing. Even in this strikes on Iran, we've seen attacks on a port in the Caspian Sea, where Iran uses the Caspian Sea to transport weapons to and from Russia. So there is potentially a possibility for turning Israel's relationship against Russia a little bit more. And it could be useful for Ukraine too, cooperation on air defense particularly. Ukraine is trying to produce something like the Iron Dome, obviously over a much larger area, but facing similar threats of ballistic missiles and drones, essentially. Cooperation on maybe producing Patriot missiles, for example. Israel's one of the only countries outside of America that can produce Patriot missiles. There's also potential maybe for sharing intelligence, for transferring Russian weapons that they've captured from Hezbollah, giving these to Ukraine. And there was an attempt in 2024 to do this, but I think it was rejected, at least officially. But I also think there's a risk in this relationship for Ukraine because European relations with Israel have significantly worsened since 2023. Europeans have been very critical of Israel's actions in Gaza. And so relations with Israel, and especially with Israel's military and military-industrial complex, who have kind of been responsible for these war crimes in Gaza, might damage the relationship with Europe a little bit. So again, Ukraine has to be very careful about how it develops, I think, these relationships.
Yeah, look how on relations between Ukraine and Israel also impact relations between Ukraine and Europe and Israel, Ukraine and Arabic countries, Ukraine and Palestine. At the same time, this expertise, military expertise of Ukraine gives Ukraine some advantages and which Ukraine tried to exchange on some benefits from relations with Gulf countries, with Israel. What I am worried about, it is keeping balance. How many can Ukraine give and how many it can receive, just to keep this balance, because in another way we will not achieve these tasks. Another reason of interfering in Ukraine or in Middle East war is relations with USA. Ukraine tries to show Trump that it can be a useful and good partner and reliable partner for USA, a partner who is ready to help and expect help from USA. But we see, yes, this position of Trump regarding Ukraine, Ukraine's attempts to help in Middle East war, when Trump said that Zelensky is the last person from which he wants to receive help, but at the same time he wasn't very criticized about Russian help to Iran. And we see this, that this also Ukraine tries to be a partner for USA. Trump doesn't want to receive this help. And how do you think will this participation of Ukraine in Middle East war help us to improve relations between USA and Ukraine?
Yeah, we spoke about how complicated relations are in the Middle East, but I think this is the most complicated relationship really because of Trump's personality and his complexes, where he can't allow himself to publicly accept help from Ukraine, who he considers to be weak and small and not important. and he focuses all of his attention and efforts on getting approval from Russia and from Putin, and he doesn't like Zelensky, so he's now just cannot comprehend how Ukraine is the most important partner here, and Ukraine can help America. So, yeah, I mean, we can quote his denial of Ukrainian help. He said, "We don't need their help in drone defense. We know more about drones than anybody. We have the best drones in the world, actually." When anyone, being here in Ukraine, it's not true.
That's why they waste Patriot's missiles against drones.
Exactly. Exactly. That's why everyone's going to Americans to get their support in drone interceptions in the Middle East. It's not happening. Everybody's choosing Ukraine because Ukraine has the best expertise. And the American military are trying to choose Ukraine too. We know, for example, in November, I think Dan Driscoll, the army secretary, came to Kyiv, and he was meant to discuss drone cooperation and how Americans really could learn from Ukrainian innovations and technology. But it was ruined by this Dmitriev peace plan, the 28-point plan, and suddenly everything became focused on this peace process that had no results. And so America kept missing these opportunities. There's also reports of Zelensky offering in August to provide security for American bases from drones, and Trump essentially rejected it. So there is, I think, some interest from the American military who recognize Ukraine's, world-leading expertise, basically. But Trump is not allowing this to happen. So again, in the long term, it feels like a possibility for Ukraine to have some benefits here, because in the long term, Trump won't always be president, or maybe Trump will lose control of Congress and be forced to take a different position. But in the short term, it's a real problem for Ukraine, because paradoxically, Ukraine being helpful actually hurts its position with Trump because of Trump's own psychology, I guess the other, there were some other complicated issues of this relationship. Weapon supplies, we've spoken a little bit about how really America's priority is this war in Iran. So Trump has never prioritized Ukraine. He's agreed to sell weapons to Europe to give to Ukraine because it makes money, but it's not a priority. It's just a way to make money. And American officials are so far denying that it's affecting transfer of weapons to Ukraine, but I think logically, long term, it has to. There's not enough Patriot missiles to keep shooting down Iranian ballistics every day in the Middle East, and also Russian ballistics in Ukraine. And we know what Trump has made his priority. So this is a concern. And I think the other major concern is around sanctions. So we've spoken about the oil prices, and this is a big political issue for Trump. And perhaps the main way he's tried to deal with it so far is by easing sanctions on Russia. So allowing, first, like you said, Indian refineries to buy Russian oil for a month, and then also from the 12th of March to the 11th of April, allowing Russian oil that's already been loaded onto tankers to be sold without sanctions. And it's looking like that will probably be extended if the war continues and oil prices stay high. So really, I think America wants this Russian oil to be sold because it brings the price lower. This isn't just related to Ukraine, of course, because America has even lifted sanctions on Iranian oil. So again, completely paradoxical and defeating the purpose of the war in the first place. But Trump's priority has become keeping oil prices lower above everything else because of his own position in the elections, basically. But this damages Ukraine as well because, well, firstly, it allows Russia to gain more money more easily. But also, I think more importantly, in the long term for Russia, it ends this norm of sanctions. It shows that sanctions can be reversed without Russia changing any of its actions. So Russia hasn't stopped the aggression against Ukraine, illegal occupation, and so on, everything, the reasons for applying these sanctions, and yet sanctions have still been lifted. So it kind of shows to Russia and to the whole world that, sanctions can be reversed without any concessions from Russia. Similarly with Belarus, America has lifted sanctions on fertilizer products because these have also been affected by the rise in oil prices and the logistics routes and so on. So it kind of, America is just showing that the world order that had tried to contain Russia is really collapsing in lots of different ways. I think as our image really shows, like the order is just falling. And yeah, so that's perhaps the most important long-term issue for Ukraine. Overall, how do you see the consequences for Ukraine? Do you think Ukraine is able to make the most of the opportunities, or perhaps is going to struggle in the short term? Or as a Ukrainian, do you feel optimistic about Ukraine's position since 28th of February, or does it feel like another real source of worry?
Yes, this world order is rebuilding now, and Ukraine can play a bigger role in it. I think that with this war in Middle East and with possibility of Ukraine to propose something to world which world don't have, it's a very good chance to increase our agency in relations with Israel, with Gulf countries, and with USA. Now risks for Ukraine are higher because it makes a war Russia against Ukraine very expensive for Ukraine and cheaper for Russia. We have some possibilities in the future, but it will depend. Could we use these possibilities in the best way? And what do you think about these possibilities, about risks for Ukraine?
It really depends on how well these opportunities are used. It needs skillful diplomacy in the Middle East, especially because it's so complicated. I think, overall, short term, really a lot of risks. Russia feeling more confident, Ukraine, being unable really to defend itself if Patriot missiles particularly are stopped. In the short term, it looks really worrying. In the longer term, I agree. This could be the moment that we look back on where we see that Ukraine's role in the world has really changed, not just role in Europe or relations with Russia or, something on the smaller regional scale, but Ukraine is becoming a global player. And so particularly for a post-peace or ceasefire world where Ukraine doesn't just have to focus its attention and efforts internally and on survival and the fight against Russia, Ukraine could really benefit from what's happening now because it's changing perceptions all around the world, I think, of who Ukraine is.
And who Russia is.
And of who Russia is as well. So I think this is a really important moment, but we just have to hope, and I see every day Ukrainians working towards making sure that this we can live to see this future, because none of this long-term opportunities will matter if in the short term the consequences of this war mean that Ukraine isn't able to continue to resist against Russia. So, yeah, I think short term, a lot of danger, and long term, maybe opportunities.
Thank you for watching us. Stay tuned. Watch us on YouTube channel Billi-Villi, read us on website billivilli.com and Facebook page Billi-Villi. See you.